Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm Elad. I'm the CEO of Craft. This is our, I think, third or fourth webinar in the last couple of months. So very happy to have everybody on. And most importantly, super excited to have Kristen Berman joining us today. Hi, Kristen.
Hello, all.
So Kristen is a good friend and also a super duper behavioral scientist and ex-product manager. So it's like all gelling in quite nicely. So today we kind of like, Kristen and I had a chat and we thought we'll talk about kind of like behavioral science, product management, and the connection between the two. So I think without further ado, I'll start with that. In terms of a little bit of like housekeeping rules for the webinar itself, I mean, by all means, throw in questions throughout if you wish. We'll try to answer during. It's probably easier to answer after, like kind of towards the end. So we'll definitely leave time for questions towards the end. If you have something burning and you really want to talk about it during, then you do that. So that's just a little bit about housekeeping. And so, Kristen, the floor is yours.
Great. Wonderful. Super excited to be here. As Elad mentioned, my background is in product management, but for close to 10 years, I've been working with Dan Ariely, thinking about how we really deeply understand human behavior so that we can apply it to the big problems in the world, whether it be helping people eat better, save money, be happier, more productive. Basically, all the places in the world where we make mistakes, behavioral science can really help people make better decisions. And as a product manager in my past, I really realized there's a massive opportunity to bring these insights into the product development world. And so for the last little bit, we've been really working with large and small companies to do just that. Some of it's research, some of it's consulting, some of it's training, but we've learned a lot along the way. And so the presentation today is basically going to talk about how we can bring those insights of behavioral science into the product management domain and some of the kind of the key that would have to happen for you to change from being just a product manager to obviously not just product manager to a behavioral.
Let's start by insulting all our guests by saying they're just part. Yeah.
We'll remind to do that again. To amplifying your craft and to adding the behavioral toolkit to it. So I'm going to go through a few slides here, and we'll have a discussion about kind of what these insights could mean. But first, I want to start with this is basically one of my favorite studies in behavioral science. So let me explain the slide. So you basically see two types of companies here. Companies on the left have less than 40 or less than 50% of folks, employees at their companies saving for retirement, and you have people on the right, employees that work at companies on the right, about over 90% of companies or employees that are saving for retirement. And so when you look at this chart, you basically kind of ask yourself, what the heck is going on? Imagine you saw this in a dashboard at your company. You have two different data sets, and you're like, oh man, something is going on with these two types of companies. What could it be? And I think in the typical product world, a product manager would start by asking customers, right? Start by saying, well, in order to figure out what's going on, we've got some data. Now we want to deep dive into the real reasons that people are saving or not saving for retirement. And so they would talk to people, whether they would just go out and say, let's investigate more. And so we did this at Irrational Labs. We basically got a segment of around 1,000 people, and we asked them why they are saving or not saving for retirement. And kind of no surprise, 86% of folks mention that they are saving because they care about their future. So this is like, I want a vacation when I'm older. I want to retire well. I want to take care of my kids. They're future oriented, and this is the reason they're saving for retirement. And 64% of folks who are not saving say pretty logical, intuitive things. I'm not saving because I don't have money and can't afford to pay my bills. How could you even ask that I would save for retirement when I just don't have enough money for my monthly expenses? This is offensive. And so you think about this question and you say, is this really the truth? And probably if you're interested in behavioral science, you may know that something else is going on. And in fact, the real reason that people are saving or not saving for retirement is because they were either auto-enrolled or not auto-enrolled in their retirement savings. So in the US, and I'm not sure how it is for your country that you're from, but in the US, basically, companies either automatically enroll you into retirement savings, by which you do nothing, like literally nothing, and you start saving for retirement. And the people on the left are not automatically enrolled. They have to fill out a form, they have to do something, and they are not saving for retirement because they do the same thing as the people on the right. They do nothing. And when you do nothing, if you're in company type 1, you don't start saving. And if you're in company type 2, you do start saving. Behavioral science calls this a default. It's automatic enrollment. You may be familiar with this. The catch here for product managers and folks who are studying behavior at any level is what percentage of people get this right? So if you were to ask people, why are you saving for retirement? In theory, we should have people say, of course, I was automatically enrolled. It was the default. And in reality, only 6% of people say the default. So I don't want to say that the 94% are lying to us. It's not intentional. They don't mean to lie. But the reality is they're not telling us the truth. And I think this is disheartening, right? This is basically, this is a big red flag for people who talk to customers as part of our job and try to understand the causes of behavior so that we can build products for them. And when we see something like this should raise a red flag. The thing that should raise and here actually is the other sad fact. We asked this in a variety of ways. So why are you saving for retirement? We said, we know that questions and survey questions are so biased in and of themselves. Let's ask people in a multiple choice way where we randomize the answers. Let's ask people in an open-ended question way. And especially when it was open-ended, almost zero. We were very liberal on our coding when we thought about, well, it's not, people may not mention the default, but if they mention anything about the new hire form, we'll give it to them. And people are just not mentioning the real reasons for why they're saving. Given that there's not many questions in our world where we actually know that there is an empirically correct answer, that the real reason they're saving is because of the default. By the way, this doesn't undermine the fact that they have attitudes and beliefs about their future, or they feel that they can't save. This is not trying to say that this is not correct. It's just not the causal reason for why they're saving. And so the reality here is when you ask people questions, either in an interview or you're just trying to understand what your customers want, it's very unlikely that they can tell you the real reasons, because we have pride, we have reputation. You would never say something to I'm too lazy to uncheck a box, right? You could never really say those words. And in fact, that is kind of what's happening, right? We're taking the path of least resistance in many decisions that we make. And it's not that we are too lazy to uncheck a box. We just are taking a mental shortcut. We're using a heuristic to make a decision. But that is unlikely to be something that someone could vocalize in an interview or a customer session. You likely don't hear people say, well, I just did what other people are doing. It was more convenient to look and see what my neighbor was doing than to make my own decision. Or actually, and this is kind of what we want our customers to say is, I don't know. It's actually the correct answer. That's the empirical correct answer. They actually have no idea why they are doing something. We don't really know why we bought the house we did. There's lots of reasons. We don't really know why we're buying this software. There's lots of reasons. And yet people are really, really confident in their answers. So, I'll pause after this, but basically one of the things we said, well, actually this whole study is totally fine if people are saying, about the defaults or about their future, about not being able to pay for bills, if they're just not that confident, because then maybe they're saying, yes, I'm answering a survey, I don't really know. But the reality is people are really confident when they say stuff like this, which I think makes the PM job that much harder, because you have people telling you answers, and they're acting as if they know exactly what they want, and they understand their preferences, and the signals they're giving you are not something that you feel like you'd question.
Yeah, and for me, if I can jump in, kind of, one, this is obviously, I mean, that is, but I mean, for me, it's a lot of, and I've seen that with a lot of product managers where they go and they interview customers, B2B, B2C, customers, consumers, and they're like, okay, I got what I need from this, right? So, and there's like multiple biases in that very basic product management process. One is like, if you know what you're trying to get to, then
yeah,
you'll definitely get that. So, but more importantly, I think the way you ask the questions, and just asking the questions rather than, how do you say, observing people in their behavior, almost by definition will give you biases in the answers, right? So it's one of those things that if I, and I do this, I talk to a lot of product leaders, and I tell them, try a different angle. Instead of going as a product manager, go as a salesperson. Like, pretend to be a salesperson and go and ask the same question. Like, not exactly the same question, but ask, like, what do you think about the product when they're actually now in a purchasing mode, or when they're actually now in evaluation mode, rather than they're like talking to the person who is, built this thing. These biases and the fact people would say things very confidently, even if they don't have a, clue as to why or why not they're doing something, is really critical for product managers to be aware of.
Yep. And I think this doesn't mean don't ever talk to customers. I think, but I do think it means we should discount, huh?
We would never say that.
Yeah, we would never say that. But I do think it means we should discount like the exact, if they're telling us something and we're taking it with linear thinking, is this is exactly what they mean, and they understand their preferences deeply. And I should acknowledge that. I think we're losing something in this kind of magic of talking to customers, which is they don't really understand their preferences, but they're telling you their attitudes and beliefs about something. And their attitudes and beliefs, as Elad said, are just influenced also by how you're asking the question, which is, it's very difficult to, to somebody's face who just made this wonderful product, tell them that you don't like something, as you know. And so our interviews are just kind of, there are a lot of noise. In fact, I think we should think about these things as not having value, as having valuable information, but it being very hard to find what that valuable information is. I'm going to share one last, because I love this study on this topic. Researchers basically, this is kind of from the early behavioral science days, they gave participants pictures of a few faces, and they said, which one do you find most attractive? And participants would look at these faces, and then they would pick one, and let's say the participant, huh?
Those specific two emojis, or no?
Not these specific two emojis. I actually couldn't find the in the paper in the appendix. They didn't.
Study?
Yeah. We're in the future. We're living in the future, and people are just responding to emojis. That's it's yeah.
Okay.
And so you can imagine somebody says, yeah, I like the one I find the most attractive is the one with lighter hair, and the researcher says, thank you very much. And kind of with a magician's sleight of hand, he says, he says, thank you very much. Can you explain why? And with a magician's sleight of hand, he shows the other picture. And so you'd expect a person to say, well, this is just not the person that I chose. And can you please show me? The majority of people do not catch this. The majority of people make up or seemingly make up answers as to why this is the person that is the most attractive, why they chose this person over other people. And this is quite fascinating because it shows how much we're storytellers, that we're really good at creating narratives. And we basically look at our decision and then we rationalize why we did that decision. Jonathan Haidt calls this the press secretary. He's an author. And what it basically means is you're, as a press secretary, and this is not a political comment, it's just over the years, press secretaries tend to stand up and say anything that happens in the political office, I will explain, and I will make up a story that fits our narrative. And so we should kind of think of our customers as really good press secretaries for themselves, right? We are really good at talking about why we did something. And Dan Ariely has his whole lab at Duke University is called Advanced Hindsight, where we just really realize things in hindsight, but it's very different than explaining the future reasons of why we would do something or not.
So before we dismiss all interviews altogether.
It's not the intent of this. I just want us to question them a little more.
Yeah, so exactly. So I'm just to synthesize what you're saying question more.
Mm.
Like I'm trying to think of good advice to give the people on the call, etc. Right? So question more and probably, and tell me if I'm find different angles to observe users, right? So it doesn't have to be an interview. It could also be like a recording of their behavior on the site. It could also be their response to a poll. It could also be many different, so kind of look at it from different angles so that you cover, or you minimize or reduce the probability of just getting a random answer. Yep. Because the person said something.
Yeah, exactly. So we think about this as kind of a mantra of focus on what people do and not what they say. And obviously, what people say is attitudes and beliefs, but what they do is more directive of what they maybe would do in the future. We call this a behavioral diagnosis. We have some content on this later on, but generally it's kind of starting with what people do first, which is usually we start with asking customers questions, collecting interview data, and a behavioral scientist flips it. We start with focusing on what people do to create a hypothesis. That hypothesis to inform our user research, our interviews. So we're coming in with a hypothesis, and then when we're doing some testing, we're identifying the assumption that we're making about behavior and testing that with either UI mocks or different interventions, instead of kind of saying, you tell us. Is a very open-ended question about what they should do, and where we're then likely to be misled as PMs versus creating the hypothesis based on a behavior-based insight.
Got it. So you're saying the guidance is look at behavior, get a hypothesis in your head, then ask around that rather than open-ended, just give me your thoughts kind of thing.
Correct. Yeah, I actually think and I don't know the current narrative in the PM world on the 5 whys, but I think the 5 whys led us down a bad path of kind of starting with that, and then saying, well, if I could just get to the core of why somebody's doing something, which is a really nice thought. I think there is underlying motivations in most of the behaviors we have, but the idea that we could correctly identify that very easily is difficult. And so there's something around, we map out all the behaviors that people do, think about the psychologies that are driving them, and then create the hypothesis that we use to do interviews.
And one of the challenges that people ask around this, and I think, I suspect in our audience, without knowing, with our listeners, I'm assuming there's probably quite a few B2B product managers, also, alongside B2C, of course. Do you feel that applies to B2B as well, as much as it does, as much as it is to B2C kind of environments?
I think so. I mean, I think even if you only have a few customers, you're basically still should be incredibly curious about the behaviors that they're doing. Now, those customers will be louder than the other customers that you have, or as a B2C customers, those few B2B customers are just going to be more loud. And I think this is even more concerning because we listen to the loud customers. It's just very difficult, either because of recency bias, because they just yelled at us, or availability bias, because it's very easy to see them in the back of our minds thinking they'll yell at me if I don't do this feature. And so we're even more biased as we think about kind of using customer information in order to develop a product that's right for their needs. So I think I think what this means is, you can have customers telling you something, and I think you have to kind of make an argument as to why you would do something different. And I think and the next section is kind of focusing on metrics and saying, well, what is the behavior we're actually trying to achieve here, and what are the things getting in the way of that behavior? We can make a much better argument than just my customer said that this is important to them. And by the way, that's still a good argument for a lot of the cases, but it probably shouldn't drive 100% of your roadmap.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, I think also, for us, at least from a craft perspective, one of the things we think about is like how to broaden the ability to collect as much feedback as possible in the most native environment as possible, right? So without the biases of going through sales necessarily, without the biases of like really just giving people a space to share what they think in a hygiene environment as possible, and then give product managers like a collection of views rather than like just like, I spoke, because one of the challenges for product managers, I think alongside many other challenges, is the fact that they can't interview like everybody or 100 customers, right? So it's very hard for them to actually interview a lot of people. And then you end up with, especially in B2B, I can attest for myself, you end up with an anecdotal subgroup of people. And then you add on top of that the biases you described here, and then you're like, I just get a random view of something kind of thing, right? So,
And I think that idea of basically categorizing and having a place for this input is helpful, because it's kind of just like interviews, where interviews are widely accepted now as biased. A lot of it's because you meet somebody, and then within the first 5 seconds, you like them or you don't, you make some judgment, and then it's very hard to change your mind. And so the process for interviews that's been developed is, kind of a Kahneman favorite, where you basically create a matrix and you're scoring each candidate on a certain criteria, and then other people score on that certain criteria. And I think that's kind of what we more need to go to in the PM world, is much more of a systematic review of input, so that you're making a rational decision based on the input versus a heuristic-based decision that could be biased for all the ways that we are, flawed but lovely humans.
Exactly. All right, let's move on to the matrix part, because that's exciting.
So this is kind of when I think about behavioral science in general, and I'm just going to frame this as the idea that I'm going to do something. I'm going to start eating healthy. And, I'm also, sometimes this happens where I maybe fail and I think that I'm going to do something, but in the future, I am not. And so
very small brackets.
Yeah.
This image is taken from one of my favorite all-time TV shows, which is called The Great British Bake Off. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. It's fantastic. I don't know if you can find it on anywhere apart from BBC iPlayer or something, but it's amazing. So sorry. Yeah. Move on.
And I think basically, we'll skip this. The world of econ has moved to this idea that basically it's not about time and utility as the main inputs to our behavior, but there are all of these other things that influence us on a day-to-day that change and shape our motivations and our behavior. And so, we've kind of moved from the world of economics to behavioral economics, and this is becoming wildly accepted as, you even see econ papers doing RCTs or controlled trials now, and they're not just looking back at past data to predict future behavior. We're actually assuming that people are irrational to start. And I think this is kind of where the PM field, this is obviously, I'm biased saying this, so take that for what it is, but
unrelated to anything that you do.
Yeah, should be moving though. It's basically we're taking people's word as gold, and we really have to move to a world where we assume our customers are rational and then build systems, processes around that. And that's actually probably why craft is very exciting, because it's helping a PM build systems and processes around your craft, which is figuring out how to help people with your product.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna briefly touch on a couple of these things, and Elad, feel free to interrupt. I know time-wise we're pretty good, but want to make sure we dive in where it's most interesting. So I think behavioral PMs differ in two basic ways. One is how people think about outcomes, and how people think about the process of getting to those outcomes. And so I want to highlight some of this And basically, I think PMs are generally okay at this, and likely everyone says that they could get better, is just having a focus on the outcome. What metric are you trying to achieve, and can you link that metric to a roadmap item? And so if you say we're going to try to increase the number of users this quarter, then that is likely linked to some strategic priority that you have and new story.
I'm going to stop you there for a second. We've met a lot of product managers, and I think the discipline itself is definitely moving into that space. But I would say there's a lot of companies still that product management is product delivery. And it's like, and you see that actually the bigger the company, the more pronounced these things tend to be, where you see companies are basically, there's like business and then there's like delivery, and product management is kind of really just like making sure that the delivery is happening. And this is one of the things from my perspective, it's probably one of the most important points to bring across in every time I talk to product managers is that notion of like, if there's no outcome and there's no goal, then you need to really question, why are you doing this thing, right? So, and it's like, it's very easy to go into what is called the build trap, and like, just like, there's an R&D team, so we're gonna give them some stuff to build. But it's not always the case that, so I couldn't stress this more, like in terms of like, this is super critical.
And I think it's also, there's so much upside in just focusing on metrics, because and I'll get to this point at the end of the story that we're about to tell, but the punchline is we are what we measure. And so if you measure something, people will go for it. And so it's actually very fun to say like, this is actually what we're focused on, and how do we get there? But if we forget that first point of what are we actually trying to achieve and how are we measuring it, then it gets confusing, and you're likely not going to get to the thing you actually want to achieve. The thing that behavioral science really adds to the metric tracking is, surprise, it's behavioral economics, but behavior, a focus on behavior. And this is actually where we see almost all companies fall down, where when we ask a company, what is the behavior you're trying to increase or decrease, most people have some idea in their head, but that idea has no relation to what their colleague has or their peer has in their head. And so there's not really an agreement or alignment on the behavior that's attempted to be changed. And most people come to us and say, well, I'd like more active use. And this is actually just not a behavior, right? Active use is logging into your product, but what do they do when they get into the product that would increase the likelihood that they get value out of it, or come back, or pay you more later, or just have general impact for what you're trying to sell. And so we really think this is kind of key. And I'd like to share a story that really just like highlighted this idea for me that's completely unrelated to product management, but really kind of shows the impact of measurement. So this is a question on how would we make roads safer? And so I don't know how many people drive, but driving is fairly popular. It's also fairly dangerous. So it's the 8th leading cause of death globally. There's 20 to 50 million people who are injured or disabled annually. It's we don't know yet how it will compete with Corona, but it's nothing.
At present, it's worse than Corona.
What'd you say? Yeah.
At present, it's worse than Corona.
Right. And so this is very interesting, because we can say, okay, this is a problem. We have roads. We can try to make them safer. How would you approach this as a product manager? And the traditional approach is to think about, how do you just get less accidents? So there's lots of accidents. Let's get less accidents. That's our desired outcome. And when you think about the behavior that would get less accidents, urban planners basically say, well, if we want less accidents, let's make it so that people can avoid, or cars can avoid people. It's a pretty logical thing. You basically have a car on a road. There's a person. If we want the person and the car not to meet, let's make it so that the cars can avoid the person, right? And that's the traditional line of thinking. And the result of this is what we really have now, which is straight, spacious, wide highways. They're very large. You know, a person would come, you'd have a lot of room to get away from this human that is intersected in your driving. And the question is this correct? Is this the correct outcome and the correct behavior in order to, you know, to increase or to change how the safety of roads? So I want folks to think to themselves about this. Is the outcome correct? Is the key behavior correct? Outcome and key behavior correct, or neither? We don't have polling software. If we did, we would, but we didn't think that far ahead. I didn't think that far ahead, so this is my.
It has an amazing polling here.
I know, but I did not. I'll take the heat on this one.
Let's do old school. Just use the chat. Who is voting A, B, C, D? I'm gonna do a very.
Oh God.
Oh, don't show.
Sorry, I was trying to do it so that I could see the chat, and then hopefully people's linked at the right time.
So for those who are conscious, you can use the chat and just tell us what do you think. I got 2 Ds so far.
Well,
I know, they're all your fans, right? All your biggest fans are here. C, D, all right. Okay, A. Go A. Oh, a lot of A's all of a sudden. D. Okay. I would say big competition between A and D.
Cool. Great.
I see right now.
I'm gonna flip. So if you haven't, because you're nervous to, you know, put a stake in your answer, that's okay. Only you will know if you're. This is more of a tech thing then. So the correct answer is D. So when roads are made straight and narrow, more people die.
Straight and wide.
Straight and wide. I was thinking about the next slide. When roads are made straight and wide, more people die by a lot. And let's think about kind of why that is. So we are correct that basically straight and wide roads increase the likelihood that you can swerve to avoid something. That is a correct chain of logic. Wonderful. And it is correct that it makes fewer accidents. There are less accidents when the roads are wide and straight. Now, where's the chain of logic fall down? These straight and wide roads also enable higher speed. People go faster. The laws actually encourage, if many urban planners, if the roads are a certain width, you can actually increase the speed, and they do. And thus there are deadlier collisions. So basically we're solving for the wrong outcome. The outcome should have been to avoid death and severe injury, right? If we actually want to decrease death. Now, there could be an argument that says we don't care about death, we care about accidents, but let's assume that basic deaths are the more important thing to solve for. So then if you say we want to avoid death and injury, what is the behavior that would increase the likelihood to avoid death and injury? And it's actually having cars slow down, which is the exact opposite thing of wide and straight streets. And so when they do that and they say, well, cars should slow down, you basically get, you know, physical barriers between cars and people, so that the cars have to slow down for the barrier. The roads are narrower to encourage slower speeds from urban planning. And more importantly, and this is kind of what has been held up in the Vision Zero, which is the initiative that did this, is that they do traffic circles at key moments. And so in places where normally there would be traffic lights and people would speed by them, you have people actually slowing down. And with this, there was a 90% reduction in fatalities with this Vision Zero project.
Somebody thing which is probably correct. Also, better car safety is also a correct outcome. I assume that's true.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I mean, so actually, I think this is actually one of the complexities of your job in any problem-solving things. There's always a lot of answers, and there's no one best answer usually, and this is the essence of prioritization. But we can't get to the prioritization piece if we don't have the measurements that we're trying to go for. So the world becomes much easier for a PM or for this Vision Zero initiative if you agree that down. Then you're like, cool, our brainstorm is like very, very easy. how would you get a car to slow down? And you can list 20 things, and then you can, you know, give it to an expert to help prioritize in urban planning. But if you're agreeing on the behavior, now all of a sudden it becomes easy to say we can do things. And again, the behavior is also a hypothesis. So we don't want to treat something as if like this is the only way to do it or the best way. When we treat something like it's a hypothesis, you can then measure and say, well, did this change the outcome?
Yeah. And so there's another question here, which I'm gonna just read through. So does this, okay.
I can't see chat, so you'll have to convey.
Does this study extend to how behavior is translated into the driver's behavior in other areas? Like, you know, like, is it making them be more annoyed and this kind of stuff, right? So in other non-manipulated areas, like kind of thing, right? So if that makes sense as a question, did it extend beyond that or no? You don't know.
Extend beyond to make people more annoyed or longer commutes.
Like, because if you slow people down, they might be, you know, angrier.
Yeah. And so I think this is a question we get a lot when we do experiments is, what about support costs? Will support costs go through the roof if we do something? And I think, I mean, we generally say, pick a number. I'm going back to the PM world and then I'll answer the Vision Zero question, but pick a number that you're comfortable with before the experiment launches or before the initiative launches. Because after the initiative launches, you're going to freak out and say there's a few customers who are calling and shut down the experiment. And that's not the rational thing to do. You've invested a lot in this product. Pick something that your team agrees is the right answer, that the business-driven answer, customer-driven answer to shut it down before you launch. That's number one. Number two, any change will affect support costs. So, you know, Netflix makes any change in their algorithm and people hate it for a very short period of time and then they get used to it. And so this is also just a basic behavioral principle of adaptation. It's very easy for us to get annoyed up front, but then we go back to our same level of happiness that we had. So I would just kind of think about that as any change will have second order effects. And then specifically with this, I think the thing that we should be concerned about is increased commute times, right? So commute is something that makes people less happy. And as a PM or someone designing this would be something you'd have to take into account is what is the death versus commute trade-off, and we can make a theory on this.
That's kind of the support cost, right? So that's kind of the thing, right? So, and I think, by the way, I love that approach to say, like, pick a number in advance. And I think in a lot of cases, I can say on behalf of B2B, but I think it's probably true for B2C, experiments die too fast because you see like a spike in something. And you kind of freak out about it, right? So I mean, we've done a bit of an experimentation on our end as well in terms of like self-service, like how self-service do you want to be, right? So and like it's a very big, like, you know, it's very common for a lot of product managers to say like we want to be like full self-service, everything, you know, full business, but it has a cost also. Whereas if you sometimes if you help somebody with so I think articulating to yourself in advance how much are you willing to accept as cost, you know, whatever that cost may be, as part of the designing of the experiment, I think is very cool. So that you don't like just kill it.
Yeah. By the way, when we say experiment, you know, in the technical world, or for us, we mean actually an A/B test, but I think I've changed some language when you have a low sample size to just say, just trying stuff. You're really just trying different things. And you have to figure out the best way for you to try different things that increases your intuition on if it's a good thing. Yeah. And so that means
I think this just, I mean, sorry to cut you off, but this talks to the size of the company in many senses, right? So smaller companies would find it very hard. Smaller companies in B2B are going to find it hard to do proper A/B testing. It's going to be hard for them, but you can do pre-post or just, as you say, try things out and just get better intuition about it. And I think as somebody in the startup world for a couple of years now, it's like it helps also just to vet your hypothesis, even if it's not a classic, fully, you know, buttoned down A/B test, because you still get a sense.
And I think this is as I become deeper in the field, and I think as anyone becomes an expert in something, we realize how much we don't know. And so I think you're in one of the main takeaways from this exercise should be don't trust your intuition, right? And so really PMing is just an exercise, or any kind of problem solving is an exercise of getting as much data as possible, making a decision, and then figuring out if that was correct, but knowing that your first guess is an intuition. And that it's really about kind of improving your intuition with different forms of data, whether that be pretending you're a salesperson and doing a phone call, or looking at how people use your product. But framing this is more of, this is a hypothesis and we're trying to improve our intuition on if this is the right answer, and then let's roll out.
Yeah, I love this framework. I mean, it is eventually what PMs are designed in a way to do, is to really just give this space. And I think one of the things, and sorry for like plugging in the product, our own product in this, but one of the reasons why we believe product needs a space to operate in is exactly because of that. It's like a mental space for product managers to just do the meticulous work of collecting information, looking at problems, prioritizing problems, designing solutions. And if you rush that, you end up with highest paid person in the room, or your own intuition, which is completely unvalidated, and you end up making bad decisions. And I think eventually the essence of product management is decision making. So,
yep. By the way, Dan Ariely had a nice thing at Google where he created the term. I don't think this actually took off, but we liked it. Was, instead of minimally viable product, we said minimally amazing product. Which basically says take a little bit more time, and try to validate what we're doing before we rush to release.
That's not gonna fly with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Changing the notion, the MVP concept. Yeah.
But the abbreviation was MAP, and so we thought maybe, it was cute, it was nice. Okay.
And Lance is highlighting it is true that there is something called minimum lovable product, which is same,
yeah,
kind of same kind of concept. So Kristen, I just want to do a bit of a time check. So we're at 46 past the hour, unless somebody's in a time zone half an hour away from us, in which case I don't know. It's confusing. I think I want to give people some opportunities to ask some questions. So I mean, maybe 2, 3, 4 more minutes, and then we can kind of like wrap it up and open it up for the people. There's been a few questions on the chat which you can answer, but I just want to make sure that if you have like a.
So I want to hit this in just a quick way, because I think probably the questions we'll ask this of like, so you don't do customer interviews, what do you do? And this is basically kind of our rigorous, we call behavioral design, and it's our rigorous attempt to basically study what people do now, what they say, with adding psychological biases. And so our team makes these maps, and they're ridiculously detailed about every single step that people have to do to get to behavior. And then we layer on these biases that your customers would have in making that decision. And we use that as input, along with the data, along with a literature review of what other people have known, along with customer interviews, to then create a solution and create the hypothesis. And so I think that's something probably PMs do inherently, because they know they're, but we make it more of like, it's a process as a starting is the kind of development process, versus just a thing that I know that I should be doing and maybe don't document. We create this artifact that teams can look at and point to and say, that's the behavior we've agreed to change. This is the map of how to get there. There's the bias that we're addressing. Our hypothesis to do it is this. And again, customer interviews are one piece of it. It's just not the whole input flow. So at that, we'll pause and do some questions.
Yeah. All right. So first of all, if I may ask the audience on the call, there's like a Q&A button. So if you don't mind posting your questions there, it's just going to be also easy for us to track afterwards. I'm going to start there and let people who asked in the chat opportunity to basically copy paste them the question. By the way, so people did ask to see the map, and like if you can share an example afterwards. Can we share it afterwards? Like, do you have like a template or something we can share with people?
Yeah, I have our behavioral design. I wonder if I have it here. This is what one of them looks like that we did, which is for applying for financial aid in the US, where it's over 20 steps. And so we have these macro steps and we have the micro steps that people have to do, you know, create a username, set a password. By the way, passwords are something that prevent people. It's not that they don't want to log in. It's just sometimes they forget their password and they'll reset it later. And in the US, if more people could remember their banking passwords, I think our financial health would be better.
If I can stop you there, just so would it be possible to send over email afterwards?
Of course, yeah. Of course.
One or two examples of this thing, right? So, all right. So, so that answers that question. One question we have is, what advice do you have for someone building the capacity for behavioral science in the product team for an e-learning company? I mean, I don't know if specifically for e-learning, but just in general, I think it's a good question. Like in terms of like, how would you handle capacity for that kind of stuff?
So, and this is not to over promote our stuff, but we do, I mean, this is a big gap that we found is basically people want to apply behavioral science no one has time for a PhD. And so, so we have to figure out some way to train.
Hire Kristen. Just hire Kristen.
Yeah. I mean, I'm here. We do, so Irrational Labs, we basically created a boot camp program where we have 2-day ones, we have 4-week ones, we have 10-week ones. Our roadmap for remote learning, we accelerated it given coronavirus. So we pushed off all of our in-person trainings, which were in San Francisco this year. And we're moving to a remote thing. So I think
everything is remote. That's it. We're not doing any more physical meetings with humans anymore. This is it. It's canceled. That whole thing is gone.
Done. The whole industry. The whole industry of face-to-face in real life is done. So we'd recommend, if you're serious about this, have one person invest time and have them be the champion in the organization. They could come to our boot camp. They could do Coursera type learning. Dan has a course out that I don't think it's still live, but I'm sure there are other courses. We think you should have generally one champion who can kind of be the person, and then have a shared language around the organization. So, and I can email this out to Elad later, but we have a series of 22 emails, and every day you get a different behavioral science principle. And the idea there is just to get people thinking differently about biases. And what happens is when, you say, oh, I learned about decoys, and your engineer's like, how would we apply decoys to our pricing page? Typically that's not happening. That idea of just taking an insight and not even thinking about your own project, but somebody else's project. But when we learn about our psychology, it's very interesting. And so I think there's something to having one champion and then spreading the seed around the organization in as light of way as possible, so people get excited and interested to learn more, or hire us. No big deal.
All right. Thanks for that. Okay, sharing the recording slides. Yes, of course we're going to show their slides in the record. Of course we're going to share afterwards. Yes. See the map again. We've answered. So that's fantastic. Sorry, I'm just doing my cleaning up my Q&A. Is it possible that by asking why you're saving for retirement, that you're asking for the dispositional behavior, which is likely emotionally biased? Would it achieve more accurate response for asking them how they become to be saving, which would extract their situational behavior, which you're actually measuring? Wow.
So I like that. I like basically having people ask, like, how did you get here today? And then they go through all of the steps that they took to get here. I think that's very nice. And likely, if you can't be there when they're doing something, asking about how they did something is really wonderful. We think generally people don't have great memories, and they don't necessarily, again, it's kind of this press secretary thing of they may not accurately remember. So you're basically asking them to recount the behaviors that they did, and would just generally kind of take in this hat of like, unclear if they remember everything, but much better than asking why. It's a starting point. Better,
but there's still biases because of just memory and this press secretary kind of concept.
So we asked people, how frequently do you forget to wash your hands? This is before Corona. Only 1 in 100 people said that they forget to wash their hands. And we ask them over periods of time, like a year, a week, a month. And so people are just unwilling to admit some things. Now, we obviously took a behavior that's has kind of some societal baggage there. It's easier to admit that you, you know, sleep in or pick your nose than forget to wash your hands. And so, but when
nobody's ever touched their face anymore, in general.
Nobody's touching their face. No one's picking any noses.
Exactly. All right. One more question. Is there a good way to validate behavioral input in a product?
Good way to validate behavioral input in a product. I'm guessing that means once you have a product to look at how people are using it. I'll assume I know what it means and just answer that question. I think there are a lot of tools out here now, whether it be usertesting.com or Full Story, that help people understand what people are doing in your product. I think, yeah, I'll caveat, so studying what people do is better than listening to what they say. They are doing something because you designed a system that made it easy or hard for them to do that thing. So sometimes you can look at somebody and say, oh, wow, I can't believe how many people are doing this one thing. And then you look at the product and all the steps to do it, and it's much easier than the other thing that you thought that they should be doing. And so when you're looking at this type of behavior, would assume that you have influenced their behavior in many ways. And so it's not maybe that they have a preference to do this thing and they just love it. It's that the system around it has created that preference.
Got it. All right. And on that happy note, we're kind of like out of time and out of questions. So I'd love to thank.
I'm going to end with this slide.
Trust.
That's what I do, not what I say.
Oh, fantastic. That's a very good ending slide. So if you want to stop presenting just for a second. Yeah. All right. So thanks so much, Kristen. Really fascinating stuff, and always fun to talk about this. And I think the angle within context, the context of product management is amazing. So I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody on the webinar and on the Zoom link. We will of course share afterwards the recording and with the kind agreement of Kristen to share whatever she agrees to share, basically. So there's a question about next session. Oh well, we'll announce that shortly, I promise. All right, thanks a lot, guys, and have a great rest of the day, evening, etc. And don't forget, wash your hands.
Yeah. Everybody else is doing it.
Exactly. Bye.